My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old and I live in Portland, Oregon. 3 years ago,
If someone had told me my own parents would sell the only place that ever truly felt like home without even calling me first, I would have laughed. Not because they were perfect. They weren't. But I believed there were certain lines parents simply didn't cross. I was wrong. And the strange part is, selling the house wasn't even the worst thing they did. The worst part was what someone found after they handed over the keys. Something I'd hidden nearly 20 years earlier. Something I never expected anyone to see again. And once that secret came to light, everything my family had spent decades pretending to be began falling apart. When people hear the phrase childhood home, they usually imagine warm kitchens, birthday candles, family photos, and laughter echoing down hallways. Mine had some of those memories, but it also held silence, the kind of silence that settles into the walls after too many arguments, the kind where everyone smiles for neighbors but barely speaks after the front door closes. Our house sat at the end of Maple Ridge Road, surrounded by tall pine trees. It wasn't large or luxurious. It had peeling white paint, an old porch swing my grandfather built, and a basement that always smelled faintly of cedar and damp concrete. To anyone driving by, it looked ordinary. To me, it held every version of who I'd ever been. My father, Richard Carter, believed appearances were everything. He ironed his shirts even on weekends. He mowed the lawn twice a week whether it needed it or not. He wanted people to believe we were the perfect family. My mother, Diane, helped him keep that illusion alive. She smiled at church, hosted neighborhood dinners, volunteered at charity events. People admired her kindness. I used to admire it too, until I realized kindness shown to strangers isn't always kindness shown at home. I have one younger brother, Jason. Growing up, Jason could do no wrong. If he broke a window, it was an accident. If I earned straight A's, my parents would say, "That's what we expect." If Jason passed one difficult class, we'd celebrate with dinner at his favorite restaurant. I learned early that expectations and appreciation aren't the same thing. Still, I loved them. Or maybe I loved the family I hoped they could become. The person who truly made that house feel alive wasn't my parents, it was my grandmother. Her name was Rose. She moved into our basement apartment after my grandfather passed away. Unlike the basement people imagine from horror movies, ours had windows overlooking the backyard, shelves packed with books, and an old stone fireplace that barely worked. Grandma Rose filled it with quilts she'd sewn herself, the smell of cinnamon tea, old jazz records, and stories. Every Saturday afternoon, we'd sit together while she baked apple pie. She always told me the same thing. "Emily, houses remember love." I never understood what she meant. She'd smile and tap the kitchen table. "The walls hear everything." I laughed whenever she said it. Now, I think she knew far more than I ever realized. When I turned 12, Grandma gave me a small leather notebook. Its cover was faded blue. Inside the first page, she'd written, "Truth has a funny way of waiting patiently." At the time, I thought it was just another one of her sayings. I started using it as a diary. Every argument, every birthday, every moment I felt invisible. Everything went into that notebook. I never imagined it would matter years later. High school became my escape. I studied constantly, worked weekends at a bookstore, applied for scholarships. Not because my parents couldn't help, because they made it clear they wouldn't. Jason, meanwhile, received a new car before graduation. Dad called it an investment. When I earned a full academic scholarship to college, Mom hugged me for exactly 3 seconds before asking whether I could move out sooner to make room for Jason's home gym. I smiled, packed my things, and left. Grandma Rose stood on the porch that morning. She slipped $20 into my hand. "I know it isn't much." I tried giving it back. She refused. "It's not the money," she whispered. "It's so you'll always remember someone believed in you." Those words stayed with me long after the $20 was gone. Life slowly improved after college. I found work as an interior designer. The pay wasn't amazing at first, but I loved creating spaces where families could actually feel at peace. Ironically, I became good at designing homes I'd never experienced myself. I rented a small apartment downtown, made close friends, built a quiet life. Visits home became less frequent. Every holiday followed the same pattern. Jason talked, Dad bragged about Jason, Mom praised Jason. I listened. Grandma smiled at me from across the table. Sometimes she'd squeeze my hand beneath the tablecloth. She didn't need to say anything. She knew. Then came the phone call that changed everything. It arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Grandma had suffered a stroke. I drove 2 hours without remembering a single traffic light. By the time I reached the hospital, she was awake, weak, but smiling. "You drove too fast," she joked. I laughed through tears. She reached for my hand. "Promise me something." "Anything." "Don't let them forget." I frowned. "Forget what?" She looked toward the hospital room door, then back at me. "The truth." Before I could ask another question, the nurse entered to check her medication. The conversation ended. I assumed we'd finish it later. We never did. Grandma Rose passed away peacefully 2 days later. The funeral was beautiful. Neighbors spoke about her generosity. Former students talked about how she'd inspired them. Even my father cried. For a moment. I believed grief had softened all of us. I couldn't have been more mistaken, because only a week after we buried Grandma, my parents started talking about selling the house. At first, I thought they were speaking emotionally. People often make big decisions after a loss. But then I noticed something strange. The for sale sign appeared far too quickly. Boxes were already packed, old furniture disappeared overnight, and whenever I asked questions, Dad changed the subject. One evening, I walked into the living room and found my parents whispering over a stack of documents. They immediately covered the papers. Mom forced a smile. "Oh, sweetheart, it's nothing important." Nothing important. That phrase echoed in my mind all the way back to Portland. Something wasn't right. I could feel it. But I had no idea how deep the truth went, or that somewhere beneath that old house, something Grandma had protected for years was waiting for the right person to uncover it. And it wouldn't be me. It would be a complete stranger. Part 2. The house was gone. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Dad had never been a patient man, but selling the family home only a week after Grandma's funeral felt cold, even for him. I called Mom twice. Both times, she sounded distracted. "Emily, your father and I have already made our decision." "But why so fast?" "It's just a house." Just a house. I stared at my phone after she hung up. To her, maybe it was. To me, it was every birthday, every Christmas morning, every conversation with Grandma Rose, every lesson she ever taught me. It was home, and now it was about to belong to strangers. A week later, I drove back to Maple Ridge Road. The familiar white house stood exactly where it always had, only now there was a large sold sign hanging beneath the real estate sign. Seeing that single word felt like someone had erased 30 years of my life. I parked across the street and just sat there. The porch swing Grandpa had built was gone. The flower boxes Grandma loved were empty. Even the curtains had disappeared. The house looked abandoned, long before the new owners had even moved in. Dad walked outside carrying another cardboard box. When he noticed my car, he frowned. "I thought you were working." "I took the day off." "You should have called." "I wanted to understand why you sold the house without telling me." He sighed dramatically. "Emily, you're making this emotional." "It is emotional. It's property. It was our family's home. Our family has moved on." I looked toward the upstairs window where my bedroom had once been. "No, you moved on." There was a difference. Dad didn't answer. Instead, he picked up another box and carried it toward his truck. Inside, the rooms echoed. Furniture had already been removed. Every step sounded louder than I remembered. Mom wrapped dishes in newspaper without looking at me. "You could have at least asked if there was anything I wanted to keep." "There wasn't much." I laughed bitterly. "My childhood wasn't much?" She finally looked up. "Emily, you donated Grandma's sewing table. We didn't have room. You sold Grandpa's clock. It was old. What about Grandma's books?" Mom hesitated. "They went with the house." I froze. "What do you mean?" "The buyers wanted everything left inside." Everything, including Grandma's library, including the basement, including the basement. Something about that word stirred an old memory. For a brief second, I could almost hear Grandma whispering, "Truth has a funny way of waiting patiently." I couldn't explain why those words suddenly felt important. That evening I checked into a small motel instead of driving back to Portland. Sleep never came. Around midnight, I found myself opening the faded blue notebook Grandma had given me years ago. Most of the pages were exactly as I remembered. embarrassing teenage crushes, school stress, family arguments, dreams of leaving town. Then, near the back, one page had been folded. I slowly opened it. The handwriting wasn't mine. It was Grandma's. Only one sentence. If they ever forget what this family was built on, the basement remembers. I read it 3 times. The basement remembers. A chill ran through me. Had she been joking, or trying to tell me something? The next morning I returned to the house. Moving trucks filled the driveway. The new owners had arrived. I almost turned around. Instead, I took a deep breath and walked toward them. A man around 60 smiled politely. "You must be Emily." I blinked. "How do you know my name?" "Your grandmother talked about you when we toured the house." "You met Grandma?" "Only once." He extended his hand. "I'm Daniel Brooks. My wife and I bought the property." His smile was warm, nothing like the investors I'd imagined. "My grandmother spoke with you?" "She insisted on showing us the basement." "The basement, again. What did she show you?" He frowned. "Actually, she never finished." "What do you mean?" "The realtor called her upstairs before she could." Something tightened inside my chest. Daniel looked toward the open basement door. "I was planning to organize a few boxes today." "I don't suppose..." He smiled kindly. "You'd like one last look?" I nodded. Together we walked downstairs. Everything looked smaller than I remembered. Grandma's bookshelves were still there, the stone fireplace, her rocking chair, the little tea table. I ran my fingers across the wooden shelf where we'd baked cookies every Saturday. Dust covered everything, but the memories felt alive. Daniel wandered toward the storage room. "I'll give you a minute." I whispered a quiet thank you. After he left, I looked around slowly. Every object reminded me of her. The old clock, the quilt she'd made, the framed family photograph. Then I noticed something strange. One of the bookshelves seemed crooked. Grandma hated crooked furniture. She fixed things immediately. I gently pushed against it. Nothing happened. Then I remembered how she'd once laughed and said, "Old shelves are stubborn." She'd pulled a single wooden peg from the side. The shelf shifted slightly. My heart began racing. Could this really be the same shelf? I searched the edge until my fingers found a small wooden pin hidden beneath years of dust. I pulled. The shelf moved, only an inch, but enough to reveal darkness behind it. I stared in disbelief. There was empty space behind the wall. Not a room, more like a narrow storage compartment. Someone had built it deliberately. My breathing grew shallow. Inside the hidden space sat an old metal box. It was covered in dust. No lock, just a simple latch. My hands trembled as I lifted it onto the floor. Before I could open it, Daniel's voice echoed upstairs. "Emily?" I quickly closed the compartment. "Coming." I slid the box behind Grandma's rocking chair. Something told me this wasn't the place to open it. Not yet. Before leaving, Daniel stopped me near the front porch. "I almost forgot." He reached into his pocket. "The movers found this upstairs." He handed me a small brass key attached to a faded ribbon. It had your name written on the envelope. I stared at the neat handwriting. It belonged to Grandma. She'd prepared this before she died. "You should probably keep it." I thanked him and slipped it into my purse. As I walked toward my car, I looked back one last time. The house already belonged to someone else, but whatever Grandma had hidden, she'd hidden it for me. I just didn't know why, and I had a feeling my parents had spent years hoping no one would ever find it. What I didn't realize was that opening that old metal box would reveal a secret capable of changing everything I thought I knew about my family. The drive back to Portland felt longer than ever. The old metal box sat on the passenger seat beside me, wrapped carefully in a blanket. I kept glancing at it every few minutes, wondering why Grandma had hidden it instead of simply giving it to me. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked the door, closed the curtains, and placed the box on my kitchen table. Then I remembered the small brass key Daniel had handed me. My name had been written on the envelope in Grandma's handwriting. With trembling hands, I slid the key into the tiny lock beneath the latch. It clicked. For a moment, I couldn't bring myself to lift the lid. Finally, I took a deep breath. Inside were dozens of neatly organized documents, old photographs, a leather journal, and a sealed envelope marked, "For Emily, open only when the house is no longer ours." Tears filled my eyes before I even unfolded the letter. Grandma's handwriting looked exactly as I remembered. My sweet Emily, if you're reading this, the house has been sold. That means your parents chose money over truth. I prayed they never would. There are things you deserve to know. Your grandfather bought this land before your father ever earned $1. When he passed away, he left instructions that this property should eventually belong to the grandchild who cared most about family rather than status. That person was always you. I delayed transferring ownership because I hoped your parents would change. They never did. Everything you need is inside this box. Do not seek revenge out of anger. Seek the truth. Truth lasts longer than revenge. I wiped away tears. Grandma hadn't hidden treasure. She had hidden the truth. The journal explained everything. Years earlier, Grandpa had placed the property into a family trust. The trust stated that after Grandma's passing, ownership would transfer according to a final amendment. That amendment had never been delivered. Someone had removed it from the family files. Someone who stood to gain from selling the house quickly. The original signed copy was sitting inside the metal box. I couldn't believe what I was reading.
Over the next few days, I met with an attorney recommended by one of my coworkers. He spent nearly 3 hours reviewing every document. Finally, he leaned back in his chair. Emily. Yes? These papers raise serious questions. About what? About whether the sale happened the way it should have. My heart pounded. So Grandma was telling the truth? He nodded slowly. If these originals are authentic, and they appear to be, your parents ignored important legal obligations connected to the trust. I wasn't interested in humiliating them. I only wanted the truth acknowledged. Weeks later, everyone gathered for a formal mediation. My parents arrived looking confident. Dad barely looked at me. Mom wouldn't meet my eyes. Their attorney spoke first. Then my lawyer quietly placed the original trust documents on the table. The room fell silent. Dad's expression changed immediately. I've never seen those. My attorney calmly slid Grandpa's original signature beside several verified documents. The handwriting matched perfectly. Then came Grandma's journal. Page after page described her concerns that the family home would be sold before her wishes were honored. No accusations, just dates, conversations, facts. The silence became almost unbearable. For the first time in my life, my father looked uncertain. He wasn't angry. He simply looked tired, older than I had ever seen him. Finally, he spoke. I thought... His voice cracked. I thought selling it would solve everything. It solved nothing, I answered quietly. It only buried the truth. No one argued. There was nothing left to argue. In the months that followed, the legal issues were resolved privately. Daniel and his wife, the buyers, had acted in complete good faith. They kept the house. I never wanted to take it from them. Instead, the financial settlement reflected Grandpa's original intentions, and the remaining trust assets were distributed according to the documents Grandma had preserved. Justice didn't erase the past, but it corrected what could still be corrected. One Saturday morning, Daniel called me. "We've finished restoring the basement." I smiled. Grandma would have loved that. "You should come see it." When I walked through the familiar doorway, everything looked different. Fresh paint, new shelves, sunlight poured through the basement windows. The old rocking chair stood in the same corner. Daniel had restored it instead of throwing it away. "We thought it belonged here," he said. I ran my hand across the worn wooden armrest. For the first time since Grandma passed away, the house felt peaceful again, not because it belonged to my family, but because the love she poured into it hadn't disappeared. Months later, my parents reached out, not with excuses, not with demands, simply with an invitation to coffee. We talked for hours. There were apologies, some tears, many uncomfortable silences. Not every relationship can be repaired overnight. Some never fully recover. But honesty gave us something we hadn't shared in years, a chance to start over. People often ask whether I regret opening that hidden box. The answer is no. Because the greatest secret inside wasn't the legal papers, it wasn't the trust, it wasn't the money, it was realizing that one person had believed in me all along. Grandma knew that truth, patience, and kindness would outlast pride. She was right. Today, I keep her blue notebook on my bookshelf. Whenever life becomes difficult, I read the first sentence she ever wrote inside it. Truth has a funny way of waiting patiently. Now I finally understand what she meant. Some secrets stay buried for years.
but the truth never stays hidden forever. And in the end, the greatest inheritance my grandmother left me wasn't a house or a trust. It was the courage to choose honesty over bitterness, compassion over revenge, and truth over silence.